Thank you. It's still going. Hi, everybody. I'm Al Filreis. I'm the faculty director of this institution, the Kelly Writers House. Thank you for coming. Thank you for braving the rain. Thank you for braving Maskville and all the things that you're braving to be here. It's an amazing season for in-person events. It's like, on one hand, everybody wants to come. On the other hand, everybody's a little squeamish. So you are wonderful people for coming. We have a pretty big YouTube audience. I want to say hi to them. Pretty much, Dana and Emily, when you're talking to the YouTube people, just have to point up that way and wave at them. And we, not only are we happy that you folks, the people watching us on our live stream, are there, but we also take seriously what you are chatting about. So our friends who are running the tech tonight will be watching the chat. And at a certain point, and I'm going to remind Emily of this, at a certain point when we're talking and doing Q&A and having a discussion, we might call on you guys in the back to tell us about an interesting question that's being posted there, or really just comments. So I'll remind you of that, Emily. Okay, so thank you for coming. The first thing we need to do is to put our hands together to welcome Dana Stevens back to the University of Pennsylvania. Yay, Dana! I'm going to say this is visit number 3, I think, or 2 anyway. So it's good to have you back here in Philadelphia. And this is Emily Wilson. I think most of you know Emily. Let's thank Emily for coming down Locust Walk. So you're in for a treat. Everybody's in for a treat. Live stream people, you're in for a treat. But the treats I'm about to describe are not for you, necessarily. We have a letterpress printed broadside that celebrates this event, and we are giving these away. These are free, and I hope you'll get one. And in fact, I'm sure Dana wouldn't be opposed to signing this thing. It's a limited edition. This is number 18 out of 32. And I'm just going to give it to you to hold on to it, so you have one of those. But more importantly, we have copies of Dana's book, which you're about to hear a lot about. I read it about almost a month ago, and I loved every minute, every page. It's really a remarkable thing, and we're about to hear more about its remarkableness. This book is available at our cost in the back, and I know that during the reception, Dana will be very happy, probably standing here, sitting here, somewhere here in the front, and would be happy to inscribe your copy. Okay, so make sure that you get a copy of the book. So what's going to happen now is that Emily and Dana are going to come up here, and they're going to be involved in a presentation. At a certain point, we will turn it to you for your questions and comments, and we'll be using this portable mic to record your questions so that the people watching the live stream can hear. Okay? All right, one more time. This is really going to be exciting. Put your hands together for these two. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Al, for the lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here both on YouTube and in person for this wonderful event, which I know will be a wonderful event because Dana is both a wonderful writer and a wonderful speaker. And so I guess I wanted to start the conversation by asking you, Dana, to talk a little bit about the book as a work of writing, because I came to it not as a Keaton head, but as a fan of Dana's writing in Slate and on the Culture Gabfest, and also as somebody interested in cultural history more broadly. So I was interested in this book as a book that sort of tries to tell the history of the 20th century, as its subtitle suggests, through the work of Buster Keaton. So I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit about the, I think, very unusual and sort of genre-busting way that this book is structured as a series of 27 chapters, so it's more than an epic. It has more than 24 books, that sort of focuses not just on the white male protagonist, but also in every chapter there's this very elegant way that you take on a new character, including a pancake house, including the dawn of film criticism, the dawn of child abuse laws. Every chapter has a sort of essayistic slant on a new element in the 20th century. So talk to us a little bit about the ways this isn't a biography.
Yeah, I feel like I say this at the beginning of every event, and I'm glad that you're welcoming it rather than making it be an apologetic disclaimer that I have to issue, where it's almost like a caveat emptor, like if you buy this book, you will not be buying a soup to nuts history of the life of Buster Keaton. And that's especially good to know because there's a brand new book out about Keaton that is a much more traditional, conventional biography that's also about twice as long as this book. And if you want to know everything that happened basically in every week of Buster Keaton's life, every contract he ever signed, just really an exhaustive and very well researched traditional biography. That one is out there. It's by James Curtis, but this is a very different story. And I'm interested to talk to you, Emily, about genre and how you see it, and other books that tell life stories in different ways as occupying a different genre. Because the fact is, if this isn't a biography, what shelf should it be shelved on? I'm happy for it to be sold as a biography if that makes people notice it. But I guess I would think of it more as a critical study or a cultural history. That's probably the best word for what it is. And a sort of thumbnail phrase that I came up with that I think is useful. It was certainly useful to me in going about writing it, is that it's a history of a time period as much as a person. It's a history of Buster Keaton's lifespan as much of his life, and as much as his life and his lifespan went from 1895, which is a year that becomes kind of obsessively important in the book because I start seeing all of these things in American culture swirling around the year of 1895. And his life ends in 1966, which also happens to be the year I was born. And 1895 just happens to be, as I mentioned in the book and in the dedication, the year my oldest grandparent was born, my father's father, who was an older father. So, his life reaches back into the 19th century. And if you think about that span of time and everything that happened in America and the world, and technology and entertainment and all the fields that I talk about between 1895 and 1966, you can just see that there's a lot of stories to be told there. There's a lot of ways to divide that span of 70 years, not an incredibly long life to live, the biblical 70, but so much happened to him during it and so much happened to the world during it. So that was sort of the idea for the framing. And that came really before the idea of writing the book. The obsession with that time period really came from 20 years or so of just being really interested in Keaton, which then expanded into being interested in silent film and the context it was made in. And suddenly, next thing I knew, it was sort of, there's a new Louis B. Mayer biography. I better read that. Or, there's a history of rail travel in the turn of the century. And all of those things just seemed to me to fit together in a way. So I guess the book was trying to sort out how they seemed to fit together.
I mean, to me, it seems an extremely original and unusual piece of creative nonfiction in that it doesn't actually, fit very neatly into the categories that publishers are of course, going to fit it into. In that, I was interested, as you were talking just then, about how you focused both on this not particularly long by the standards of mortality, but also enormous for giving a whole history in less than 400 pages of this history of 70 years, but then also your own life, that it actually interweaves an element of memoir along with cultural history, along with, I think, very precise and subtle film criticism, which of course is something you're fantastic at, but then also cultural history. So I'm interested in, do you have any models in terms of, are there any other books out there that do all of these things? Because I have trouble thinking of a book that does quite as many different things at the same time as this one does.
I mean, there are books that do it better, I think, but it is an unusual thing to try to do with a book. The book that inspired me, and that at the beginning of the project I would cite to people in pitch meetings and things like that. There weren't a lot of pitch meetings with this book. I mean, it really just sort of found the right editor and found a home, and then went from there. But if I had to sit in a room with someone who knew nothing about Keaton or me and tell them about the book that I would mention would be this book called River of Shadows by Rebecca Solnit. I don't know if anybody here knows that book, from 2007, 2008, something like that. And it is about the life story of Edward Muybridge, the photographer who famously photographed the running horses, for Leland Stanford, on this bet, this idea that they were trying to figure out if a horse's hooves all leave the ground at the same time. And he arranged a kind of tripwire photography setup where he could take sequential pictures of the horses, and that's often cited as one of the precursors to cinema, right? Because it's like a flip book style. But Edward Muybridge had also not incredibly long, but incredibly bizarre and exciting life that involved, a murder trial and photographing the last Native American reservation in California that was sort of being cleared out by the California state government at the time, photographing the railroad as it made its way far west. he, changed his identity. He was born in England and, sort of radically transformed himself into this character to come to the U.S. I can't even get into everything that was amazing about Edward Muybridge's life. But the way Solnit tells his story is to do something a little bit like you were saying, to make each chapter sort of a freestanding essay. This one's about the railroad. This one is about disappearing reservations. This one is about, scandal and tabloids and murder trials at the turn of the century. And telling his life that way just became about so much more than him, and coming away from that book, I'm not sure that I can remember the chronicle of Muybridge's life as well as I can remember just the portrait that she gives of technology in a time not that different from the time I'm writing about, a little earlier, but similarly, roiled by all these technological changes and so forth. So I think I was already well into my Keaton obsession by the time I read that book, but the idea of using that form to try to enter into his life probably came from reading her.
Mm-hmm. So we should definitely talk about Keaton as well as about form, and as well as about the form of the book. And maybe a place to start would be his relationship with his father and the initial Three Keatons act. And I'm wondering if you could just start off by telling us a little bit about that, but then about how the father-son theme sort of runs through Keaton's work.
Right.
Because I guess I'm coming to this partly thinking comedy has always been about generational conflict ever since the time of Aristophanes and the son beating up the father in the clouds. And it's a theme that sort of runs through Roman comedy. It runs through a lot of 19th century literature. Also has this theme of generational conflict. So I would love to just have you talk a little bit about how Keaton gives a different slant on all of that.
Yeah, when you were talking about father-son conflict, I thought of Hamlet on the one hand and The Simpsons on the other hand. And in a way, Keaton's relationship with his father brings in elements of all of that. It has these tragic elements and dramatic elements that really come out in, for example, his film Steamboat Bill Jr., that is explicitly about the relationship between a son and father. And really the drama of that movie is them working out their relationship. But of course, it's happening against the backdrop of, tornadoes and falling houses and people, being rescued from rivers and things like that. But really what it is about is a father-son reconciliation. But the Three Keatons act that young Buster grew up doing with his parents traveling around the vaudeville circuits was more like the Simpsons relationship. Really the central joke of his and his father Joe's, dynamic on stage was a lot like Homer Simpson and Bart Simpson. It was this mischievous pest of a boy who would pester his father on stage and goad him to the point that the father, who usually started off the act with this ironically intended ballad or poem that he would recite about gentle parenting and how it's important to be forbearing with our children, and that would all be a setup for this backstage dramatic irony, that we the spectator would see Buster doing something, devising something that was going to somehow knock his father over or, whack him in the face with a basketball or something. And as soon as that happened, it became a conflagration of father-son violence in a way that was really extreme. And they were regarded as the most violent act in vaudeville, certainly the most violent family act in vaudeville. And as I write about a lot in the book, the laughter that accompanied the Three Keatons was always accompanied by gasps and terror. And that was kind of part of the act, right? What audiences came for was to witness the acrobatic feats that this little boy could do and laugh at the kind of general mayhem, but also to be horrified that anyone could survive such a thing. And as a result, there was also a constant battle between the Keatons and the Society for the Protection, what is it called? Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the SPCC, which was a fairly newly formed organization at the time, which I get into it in the book. It was about 20 years old. And it seems like Elbridge Gerry, who was the founder and at that time the head of the society, took a special, I don't know about dislike, but he took a special interest in shutting down the Keatons Act. I think he thought it was setting a really bad example for what children on stage should be doing. He didn't think there should be children on stage performing at all. And so the Keatons were constantly being followed when in New York State, the only place that the SPCC had jurisdiction then, in an attempt to shut down their act. But they remained the most popular family act on the circuits anyway, and kind of found ways around that throughout those years. And much later, Keaton always vehemently denied that his childhood had been abusive. But by our modern standards, it's pretty hard to look at the way he was treated as the way that you would want to bring up your child. He never got to go to school. He was constantly on the road, and he performed twice a day in this really brutal act that a couple of times landed him in the hospital, although he was remarkably resilient and not injured nearly as often as it seems like he would have been.
Right, and especially as you bring out, increasingly the father who was hurling him around was drunk. And you'd think that would make it even more dangerous, and that the horror would become greater and greater.
And that's exactly what happened. And that's why the act broke up when it did. I mean, it seems like, there's nobody was keeping a diary of this, so there's not an exact chronology of it, but it seems like it was in Keaton's teens specifically that his father's kind of social drinking, his kind of tendency to drink too much and occasionally get in a fight and land in jail started to be more turned on the family, and in part, I think it was that the act was harder to do because his son was growing up and getting bigger and harder to throw around. Joe was getting older and did not like getting older, so there was a lot of repressed rage. But for whatever reason, there started to be a period in Buster's teens where the act was more dangerous to Buster's mother as well, who was also, I think, subject to some abuse from her husband. So there's a very dramatic scene that occurs in 1916, 17, around that time, which is in the book too, where Buster's mother turns to him on a train as they're riding to their next gig and says, "We need to break up the act. I can't go on like this anymore." And Buster, who had always, throughout his life, been a pretty passive figure, he doesn't take a lot of initiative, and he's a terrible businessman and makes all kinds of decisions that make his career suffer because of that, and his life suffer. Because his mother asked him to, and because she was the one who was suffering, he was willing to do it, and he broke up the act at that time. And that's the moment that, somewhat by mistake, he ended up moving into film instead of the stage.
Which then sort of leads to this technical problem of what does he do once he doesn't have somebody to hurl him around anymore? And also then how does he deal with this new medium of moving from stage to film, and what are both the opportunities and also the challenges of that new medium?
Right.
So maybe I guess one possible way to lead from where we were is to talk about the new medium, but then also to talk about how he had this very problematic and violent home and life, but then he recreates the violence of home by having home fall on top of him, literally, and over and over and over.
Right.
And I think that's the way we're going to go in terms of the clips. So that might be a possible way to